Today we will explore the forgotten methods that medieval hunters used to track their prey in the ancestral forests of Europe, a silent art that required much more from human senses than modern technology could ever replace. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a European forest in the 13th century. The tree canopies are so dense that sunlight can barely penetrate down to the ground covered in decomposing leaves. The air is humid and carries the intense scent of moss, wet earth, and resin. There are no paved roads, no detailed maps, no compasses accessible to the common man. In this setting, a small group of men walks in absolute silence. Their steps are calculated, slow, almost imperceptible. They do not speak. Their eyes scan every inch of the ground, the tree bark, the lowest branches. One of them crouches, touches the earth with his fingertips and raises his eyes toward a distant bush. He has just found the first sign that a deer passed through there a few hours ago. The medieval hunt is about to begin. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must step back in time and understand what the forest represented to medieval man. The forest was not a leisure park, nor a space for romantic contemplation as it began to be idealized centuries later. For medieval communities, the forest was simultaneously a source of life and a territory of danger. From it came wood for construction and heating, wild fruits, mushrooms, medicinal herbs, and above all, the game meat that fed everyone from the halls of castles to the humblest tables when the laws permitted. But the forest also sheltered wolves, furious wild boars, and the impenetrable darkness of moonless nights. Navigating this environment required a set of skills that took a lifetime to master. Medieval hunting was not an improvised activity. Quite the opposite. It followed a complex system of rules, hierarchies, and knowledge passed down from generation to generation. At the top of this pyramid was the nobility, for whom hunting represented not just a source of food, but an exercise of power, a demonstration of martial skill, and a social ritual of enormous importance. Just below were the professional hunters, the foresters and trackers who dedicated their lives to the study of animals and terrain. And at the base, invisible to the eyes of official history, were the common people who often hunted illegally to avoid starvation, risking brutal punishments in exchange for a rabbit or a pheasant. Animal tracking was the foundation upon which all medieval hunting was built. Without the ability to locate, identify, and follow a prey through miles of dense forest and uneven terrain, no hunt would be possible. And this skill, far from being instinctive, was a refined science that required years of training. Young apprentices, many of them starting their training as children, were educated to read the landscape like one reads a manuscript. Every mark on the ground, every broken branch, every displaced leaf told a story to those who knew how to interpret it. The first and most fundamental sign a tracker looked for was footprints. However, identifying a footprint in the medieval forest was not as simple as it might seem. The soil of European forests varied enormously depending on the season and the region. In spring and autumn, the damp and muddy earth preserved marks with remarkable clarity, allowing an experienced tracker to determine not only the species of the animal, but also its approximate size, sex, age, and even its state of health. In summer, when the ground became dry and compact, footprints were much harder to identify, requiring an extraordinarily sharp eye. In winter, snow functioned as a blank canvas upon which every creature left its record with almost surgical precision. Medieval trackers learned early on to differentiate the marks of each species. The red deer, considered the noblest and most coveted prey, left unmistakable tracks for a trained eye. Its heart-shaped footprints, with two elongated and pointed hooves, varied in size according to the animal's age and build. A young deer left smaller and lighter marks, while a mature stag, 5 or more years old, known as a hart in the English terminology of the time, produced deep and well-defined footprints that revealed its considerable weight. Trackers measured the width and depth of these marks, compared the distance between steps, and evaluated the angle of the impressions to determine if the animal was walking calmly, trotting, or fleeing at a gallop. But footprints were only the beginning. The medieval tracker had a much broader repertoire of signs to decipher. Animal excrement, which medieval hunting terminology treated with specialized and precise vocabulary, constituted a very rich source of information. Medieval illustrations show hunters examining deer droppings on a table, analyzing them with the same seriousness a doctor would examine a patient. From the consistency, size, shape, and content of the excrement, a skilled tracker could estimate the animal's species, its sex, its approximate age, and the type of food it consumed. Fresh and moist excrement indicated a recent passage, while dried and faded droppings revealed that the animal had passed through days ago. Another fundamental sign was the marks left on trees. Male deer, during the period when their antlers grow and develop, rub them against trunks and branches to remove the velvety layer of skin that covers them. These friction marks, which French medieval treatises called frayeurs, left visible scars on the tree bark that a tracker could identify and interpret. The height of the marks indicated the size of the animal. The intensity of the abrasion suggested the deer's strength and age, and the freshness of the exposed sap revealed how long ago the animal had been there. The forest floor was a living map for those who knew how to read it. Displaced leaves, disturbed moss, branches broken at the chest height of a large animal, narrow trails where the undergrowth had been trampled repeatedly over months or years. All of this composed a visual vocabulary that the tracker mastered fluently. The areas where a deer lay down to rest, known as reposés in French treatises, were identifiable by the circular mark of flattened vegetation and the residual heat that could be felt to the touch on cold mornings. A tracker who found one of these resting areas knew the deer was not far off and would likely return to that location. The vegetation also spoke to those who observed it closely. Bushes with torn leaves or branches bent in the direction of an animal's movement indicated the route followed by the prey. Gnawed or peeled bark from young trees revealed the presence of deer feeding during the night. Trampled mushrooms, roots exposed by digging, partially consumed berries. Each of these details added a piece to the puzzle the tracker mentally assembled while advancing through the forest. Water was another crucial element in the art of tracking. Animals need to drink regularly, and the banks of streams, lakes, and puddles constituted mandatory points of passage. Medieval trackers knew that the best footprints were found in the soft mud of the banks of watercourses, where the moist earth preserved impressions with exceptional sharpness. These locations functioned as strategic observation points, where the tracker could evaluate which animals frequented the area, at what times and with what regularity. The trails connecting resting areas to water points formed natural corridors of movement that hunters learned to map mentally over years of experience. There was, however, a dimension of tracking that went beyond visual observation. The senses of smell and hearing played equally important roles. Medieval hunters were deeply aware of wind direction, a variable that could determine the success or failure of an entire hunt. Deer possess an extraordinarily sharp sense of smell, capable of detecting human presence hundreds of meters away when the wind blows in the wrong direction. For this reason, trackers always positioned themselves against the wind. That is, so the breeze blew from the animal toward the hunter and not the other way around. This technique required constant attention, as the wind direction could change at any moment, especially inside forests, where topography and vegetation created unpredictable air currents. Hearing was also an indispensable tool. In the deep silence of the medieval forest, where there were no engines, machines, or any industrial noise, the sounds of nature gained a clarity that modern man can hardly imagine. The snapping of a twig under an animal's weight, the rustling of leaves caused by a creature in motion, the distant call of a bird alarmed by the passage of a predator. All these sounds composed a symphony that the experienced tracker decoded automatically. Birds, in particular, functioned as involuntary sentinels. When a large animal moved through the forest, nearby birds often emitted alarm calls that an attentive hunter could hear and interpret as an indication of the presence and direction of the prey's movement. It is at this point that the history of medieval tracking meets the history of hunting dogs, indispensable companions that transformed the art of following a prey from a purely human skill into a collaboration between species. Dogs played such a central role in medieval hunting that entire treatises were dedicated to their breeding, training, and veterinary care. Different breeds were developed over centuries to fulfill specific functions in the hunt, and the sophistication of this system was remarkable. Among all medieval hunting dogs, the Lima occupied a position of special prominence in the context of tracking. The Lima was a scent hound kept permanently attached to a leash, a long rope called a lime, from which its name was derived. This animal was trained to track in silence, without barking or making any noise that could alert the prey. Its function was to locate the desired deer before the start of the hunt itself, following the scent trail the animal left as it moved. The Lima and its handler would set out before dawn, often the day before the hunt, to scour the forest and identify the location of a suitable deer. This preliminary work was absolutely essential, for without it, the hunt would be a blind and inefficient exercise. The Lima handler was a highly specialized professional who combined his own visual tracking skills with the incomparable scenting ability of his dog. While the man observed footprints, excrement, and marks on trees, the dog followed an invisible trail of scent molecules that remained suspended in the air and deposited on the vegetation. Together, man and dog formed a tracking unit whose effectiveness far surpassed the capacity of either alone. The handler learned to read his dog's behavior with the same precision he read the signs of the forest. A subtle change in the animal's posture, an acceleration in the rhythm of its steps, the tilt of its head, all this communicated information that the handler interpreted and used to make decisions about which direction to follow. Once the Lima and its handler identified and located a suitable deer, usually a mature and imposing hart, worthy of a noble hunt, the elaborate ritual preceding the chase itself began. On the morning of the hunt, participants gathered in a clearing for an outdoor meal known as the assembly or gathering. This was no simple meal, it was a council of war. The Lima handlers who had scouted the forest in the preceding hours presented their reports to the master of the hunt, describing the deer they had found, their characteristics, and their location. They brought as evidence the droppings they had collected, the marked branches they had cut, and the detailed observations they had recorded. The master of the hunt evaluated all this information and decided which deer would be pursued that day. This selection process reveals how much medieval hunting was a cerebral activity, not just a physical one. It was not about going out into the forest and killing any animal that appeared. The noble hunt was a meticulously planned event, in which the choice of prey followed rigorous criteria of quality and challenge. The selected deer needed to be large enough to represent a worthy trophy, mature enough to ensure the chase would be long and exciting, and healthy enough to offer a good run. The ability of trackers to provide precise information about these attributes without ever having seen the animal directly, but only through the signs it left in the forest, was considered a demonstration of extraordinary mastery. After the selection of the deer, the hunt moved into its most dramatic phase. Mounted hunters positioned themselves at strategic points along the animal's likely escape route, while dog handlers prepared their animals for the chase. Groups of greyhounds, agile and fast-racing dogs, were positioned at relay points along the course. The Lima was then led back to the spot where the deer had been detected, and its handler used it to unharbour the prey, that is, to force it out of its hiding place and start it running. The moment the deer was sighted, the sound of the hunting horn echoed through the forest, signalling the start of the chase. The hunting horn was a communication instrument, as essential as the dogs or weapons. In the dense medieval forest, where visibility was often limited to a few meters, the hunt participants depended on sound to coordinate their actions. Each situation had its own horn call, a coded musical language that all trained hunters understood. There were specific calls to indicate that the deer had been sighted, that the dogs had been released, that the prey had changed direction, that the animal had been cornered, or that the hunt had ended. The sound of the horn could be heard more than a kilometer away inside the forest, making it the most effective communication system available at that time. While nobles pursued deer on horseback as a demonstration of status and skill, there were other forms of hunting that relied even more intensely on tracking techniques and represented the daily reality for much of the population. Hunting with a bow and arrow, for example, required the hunter to approach his prey at a very short distance, often less than 30 meters, for the shot to have any chance of being effective. This meant the hunter needed not only to locate the animal, but also to approach it without being detected, a task that demanded absolute mastery of camouflage and silent movement techniques. Medieval hunting treatises recommended the use of green clothing to blend in with the forest vegetation. Gaston Phoebus, the Count of Foix, who wrote one of the most famous hunting treatises of the Middle Ages, the Book of the Hunt, Livre de la Chasse, between 1387 and 1389, even recommended that the bow be painted green to prevent its glint from giving away the hunter's position. Arrows were to measure 8 palms in length, with 2-edged points, and barbs 5 fingers long and 4 wide. Bows, preferably made of boxwood or yew, were to be strung with silk, a material more elastic than hemp that allowed for more powerful and silent shots. Gaston Phoebus's treatise deserves special attention in this narrative, as it represents the most complete and detailed record of medieval hunting practices that has reached us. Written in French and dedicated to Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the Book of the Hunt is divided into sections that systematically address every aspect of the venatic art. The first part describes the animals that can be hunted, from the deer to the otter, detailing their habits, behaviors, and physical characteristics. The second part is dedicated to dogs, their breeds, training, and care. The third part teaches tracking techniques, including how to follow trails, interpret signs, and locate game in the forest or field. And the fourth part deals with traps and other capture methods. What makes the Book of the Hunt particularly valuable is the wealth of practical detail that Gaston Phoebus includes in his text. He does not limit himself to abstract descriptions, but offers specific instructions based on decades of personal experience. He describes, for example, the elements that allow one to recognize the presence of animals in the woods, such as frayeur, the places where deer rubbed their antlers on branches, reposer, the places where the animal lay down in the vegetation, and foulée, the marks left by the animal's passage through the foliage. This information constituted the alphabet of the silent language trackers used to decipher the forest. Gaston Phoebus's work did not emerge in isolation. It is part of a literary and practical tradition that developed over centuries in medieval Europe. Feudal lords were great appreciators of hunting and falconry treatises, and works of this type abounded in England, Italy, Germany, and France, often translated and retranslated between different languages. Before Gaston Phoebus, other important texts already existed, such as the books of King Modus and Queen Ratio, Les Livres du Roi Modus et de la Reine Ratio, written between 1354 and 1376, which also detailed tracking and hunting techniques. After Gaston Phoebus's death, his work was translated and adapted into English by Edward of Norwich, 2nd Duke of York, between 1406 and 1413, under the title The Master of Game. This English version became the definitive reference on hunting in medieval England and survives in 27 known manuscripts. Another fundamental treatise that illuminates our understanding of the medieval relationship with the natural world is The Art of Hunting with Birds, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, written by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. Although focused primarily on falconry, the art of hunting with birds of prey, this monumental treatise, the preparation of which consumed more than 30 years of the emperor's life, contains detailed observations on animal behavior, forest ecology, and tracking techniques common in his time. Frederick II combined Arabic sources, Aristotelian texts, and his own direct observations to produce what many consider one of the first scientific works on ornithology and zoology in Western history. Falconry represented a fascinating and complementary branch of medieval hunting that also depended on tracking skills, though of a different nature. While hunting with dogs required the hunter to follow terrestrial trails, falconry demanded the ability to read bird behavior, interpret wind currents, and anticipate the movements of both the trained falcon and the prey it pursued. Medieval falconers were extraordinary observers of the natural world, capable of detecting nuances in a bird's flight that indicated fatigue, confusion, or determination. The relationship between the falconer and his bird was built over months of patient training and mutual observation, and required a serene and controlled temperament as any display of irritation or impatience could permanently ruin a sensitive bird. In the social hierarchy of medieval hunting, falconry occupied a place of extraordinary prestige. Different species of birds of prey were associated with different levels of the social scale. The gerfalcon was reserved for kings and emperors, the peregrine falcon for the high nobility, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, servants were relegated to the kestrel, a small bird capable of capturing little more than mice and sparrows. Keeping a bird above one's social position was subject to severe punishments. Returning to the forest and the dirt ground, one must consider an often overlooked aspect of medieval hunting: the use of traps and other methods that treatises of the time classified as less noble, but which were essential for the survival of rural communities. Traps represented a form of hunting that depended entirely on deep knowledge of animal habits and routes, that is, the same tracking skills that sustained noble hunting, but applied differently. To successfully position a trap, the hunter needed to identify animal movement corridors, the spots where they fed, drank water, or rested, and the times they frequented each location. This knowledge was accumulated over years of patient observation and passed down orally from father to son, constituting a tradition of ecological wisdom that was rarely recorded in writing, but was absolutely vital for the survival of rural populations. The relationship between hunting and the laws that regulated it constitutes one of the most revealing chapters of the social history of the Middle Ages. In England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror introduced a system of forest laws that radically transformed the population's access to hunting and natural resources. Vast stretches of land were designated as royal forests, areas reserved exclusively for the use of the king and those to whom he granted permission. In these areas, which at the height of their extent covered about a third of English territory, the hunting of deer, wild boar, and other prey was prohibited for everyone except the authorized nobility. The punishments for those who violated these laws were terrible, including blinding, mutilation, castration, and, in the early years after the conquest, death itself. The forest laws did not just prohibit hunting, they restricted practically all the uses the population made of the forest: cutting trees, gathering firewood, collecting fruit, fishing, digging peat for fuel, allowing domestic animals to graze in clearings. All of this became prohibited or severely regulated within the boundaries of the royal forests. For the communities that depended on these resources for their survival, the forest laws represented an economic and social catastrophe. It is no surprise, therefore, that they generated enormous popular resentment, a resentment that found its most famous expression in the legend of Robin Hood, the outlaw who hunted in the royal domains of Sherwood Forest and redistributed the fruits of his transgression among the poor. The enforcement of the forest laws was the responsibility of special officials called foresters, who were tasked with patrolling royal territories and punishing offenders. These foresters were among the most hated of all crown officials, partly because their duties put them in direct conflict with the local population, and partly because they had a reputation for corruption, illegally enriching themselves at the expense of the resources they were supposed to protect. Fines and imprisonment were the most common punishments, but the brutality of the penalties in the early times after the Norman conquest left deep marks on the English collective memory. Illegal hunting or poaching was an extremely widespread activity throughout the Middle Ages, practiced by all layers of society, from starving peasants to ambitious nobles and even members of the clergy. Poaching was what historians call a social crime, an illegal activity that enjoyed broad tolerance and even sympathy from the population. Neighbors rarely reported an illegal hunter, and when one was caught, they often suffered no punishment because the community refused to testify against them. In many cases, poaching was an organized activity, with groups of hunters working together to capture animals in the royal forests and sell them in local markets. Some of these groups worked for feudal lords or even for monasteries that wished to supplement their provisions without drawing attention. Resistance to capture was also part of the reality of medieval poaching. Illegal hunters, cornered by foresters, often reacted with violence, even going so far as to assault and kill the officials who tried to arrest them. There are records of foresters wounded by arrows fired by fleeing hunters, and even a legendary account, according to which St. Thomas Becket performed the miracle of healing a forester struck in the throat by a poacher's arrow. This violence reflects the intensity of the social conflict that the forest laws generated, a conflict that lasted for centuries and only began to be mitigated with the promulgation of the Charter of the Forest in 1217, a document that granted free men certain rights to use the royal forests, including the collection of firewood, honey and fruit, fishing and animal grazing. It is important to note that the skill of tracking animals was not exclusive to the nobility or their professional hunters. The common people, especially in the most remote rural areas, preserved tracking traditions that dated back to times long before the arrival of the Norman forest laws. These traditions represented an ecological knowledge accumulated over countless generations, a wisdom that allowed communities to identify which animals inhabited their lands, at what times of year they were most active where they could be found, and how they could be captured with minimum risk and effort. This knowledge was transmitted orally, taught to children during long walks through the forest, and was never recorded in luxuriously illustrated treatises like those that adorn the libraries of great museums. Its importance for the survival of rural communities, however, was no less than that of the elaborate hunting rituals of the nobility. The seasons of the year dictated the rhythm of medieval hunting, and consequently, the tracking techniques employed in each period. The deer hunting season, the most prestigious of all, traditionally began in early May, when male deer emerged from their winter hiding places and began to graze in open fields, and extended until mid-September. During this period, trackers needed to adapt their techniques to the lush summer vegetation, which made identifying footprints on dry ground more difficult, but facilitated the detection of feeding marks on bushes and young trees. In autumn, when deer entered the mating season and became more aggressive and less cautious, tracking techniques changed again, exploiting the characteristic calls and behaviors of that period. Winter brought with it the boar hunt, a dangerous animal that required courage and specialized tracking skills, as the boar was harder to pursue with dogs in terrain covered with snow and dead vegetation. The wild boar deserves special attention in this narrative, as its hunt represented one of the greatest challenges and dangers a medieval hunter could face. Unlike the deer, which fled from hunters, the boar was capable of turning on its pursuers and attacking them with its sharp tusks, causing serious or fatal wounds. Boar tracking techniques were similar to those employed for deer, focusing on footprints, excrement, digging marks in the ground where the animal searched for roots and tubers, and damage to vegetation caused by its passage. However, the hunt itself required additional precautions, and hunters often used specialized dogs to corner the animal before approaching for the final blow with spears designed specifically for this purpose. In some countries, there were spears manufactured especially for each type of prey, with differences in length, point size and center of gravity, reflecting the extreme specialization that characterized medieval hunting. Among predators, wolves and foxes were the most sought-after prey. These creatures were hunted not only for their magnificent pelts, used in the making of luxury clothing, but also to protect domestic herds and the populations of deer and boar that the nobility wished to preserve for their hunts. Each region of medieval Europe had its own traditional methods for hunting wolves and foxes, including the use of traps, specialized dogs, and surrounding techniques that required the cooperation of dozens of participants. Tracking predators represented a particular challenge, as these animals were naturally cautious, skilled at avoiding detection, and capable of covering much greater distances than herbivorous prey. Horses played an equally essential role in medieval hunting. The horses used in hunting were not the heavy destriers employed in war, but lighter, more agile and resilient animals capable of navigating the irregular terrain of the forests. Coursers, valued for their speed, were used in long-distance pursuits. Rounceys, more versatile horses, served as general mounts. Selective breeding included crossing with lighter eastern lineages, such as Arabian horses introduced starting in the 12th century, to improve speed and endurance. The training of a medieval hunter was a long and rigorous process that began in childhood. Boys destined to become professional hunters started their apprenticeship at 7 or 8 years of age as pages in the kennels. In this phase, they cared for the dogs, cleaned the enclosures, fed the animals, and learned the names and personalities of each one. This daily contact built an essential intimacy for future hunts. As they grew, they were promoted to helpers who participated in the hunts, learning in practice the tracking techniques, the interpretation of footprints and excrement, and the reading of signs in the vegetation. An interesting detail is that healthy dogs did not receive meat at home, as their trainers wanted them to associate meat consumption exclusively with the forest and the activity of hunting. Surprisingly, the training of young hunters did not strictly follow the class divisions that characterized most aspects of medieval life. Boys from noble families and from common families were educated together in the craft of hunting, learning the same techniques and sharing the same tasks. The crucial difference, however, lay in the final destiny of each. While the sons of nobles were prepared to rise from the position of page to that of mounted hunter, with the right to pursue the prey on horseback as a full participant in the hunt, the sons of common families remained in the condition of assistants, dog handlers, or keepers, never being able to aspire to the social position that mounted hunting conferred. Even so, these professionals of humble origin mastered tracking skills that many nobles would never achieve, for it was they who spent their entire lives in the forest, accumulating irreplaceable practical knowledge. Although hunting was predominantly a male universe, there are records that noble women also participated in certain forms of hunting. Falconry was considered appropriate for ladies, as it did not involve direct confrontation with dangerous animals. There are also records that noble girls received instruction in archery and basic tracking techniques. One form of hunting associated with female participation was the bow and fixed position method, in which the prey was driven by beaters and dogs toward a group of hidden archers. Ladies could participate in this method, which was safer and less physically demanding, and often took place in enclosed parks designed for this purpose. Religious symbolism permeated all of medieval hunting culture. The deer was frequently associated with Christ in medieval iconography, and the deer hunt could be interpreted as an allegory of the Christian search for truth and salvation. The lives of saints, such as Saint Eustace and Saint Hubert, included episodes involving hunts that became moments of divine revelation, popular themes for illuminated manuscripts and cathedral-stained glass. Saint Hubert of Liège, whose biography tells how hunting almost led him away from God before his conversion, is to this day considered the patron saint of hunters. In secular literature, the knight pursuing his prey through the forest was used as a symbol of the man seeking the favor of his lady, reflecting the central position that venetic activity occupied in medieval culture. Over the centuries, medieval tracking techniques evolved in response to environmental, technological, and social changes. The gradual decrease in wild animal populations in certain regions forced hunters to develop more refined methods of locating and pursuing. The introduction of the crossbow into the hunting arsenal, though controversial for being considered less noble than hunting with dogs, brought new possibilities for long-distance kills that altered approach and tracking strategies. And changes in the forest laws, especially after the Charter of the Forest of 1217, partially redistributed access to game resources, allowing broader segments of the population to legally practice certain forms of hunting. However, it was the advent of gunpowder and firearms that marked the beginning of the decline of traditional tracking techniques. The first firearms used in hunting were heavy and imprecise, but their ability to kill at greater distances altered the relationship between the hunter and his prey. Over time, the need to approach silently diminished, and with it the importance of the tracking skills that had defined hunting for millennia. Falconry went into sharp decline starting in the 16th century, and the great hunts with dogs became increasingly nostalgic rituals. The ecological consequences of medieval hunting also deserve attention. The wild boar was hunted to extinction in England. Wolves disappeared from the British landscape at the end of the 15th century. Although the forest laws were designed in part to protect wildlife, their effectiveness was limited by the constant pressure of both legal and illegal hunting and by demographic growth. Looking back through the mist of centuries, what emerges from this history is not just an account of outdated hunting techniques. What emerges is the portrait of a deeply intimate relationship between human beings and the natural world, a relationship built on patient observation, respect for the complexity of ecosystems, and the understanding that survival depended on the ability to read and interpret the signs that nature offered. Medieval trackers, whether they were nobles mounted on magnificent horses or stealthy peasants gliding through the shadows, shared the same fundamental knowledge, the awareness that the forest was a living organism, full of messages for those who had the patience and humility to listen to them. Footprints in the mud, excrement examined in the light of a cold morning, branches broken at the chest height of a deer, leaves displaced by a nocturnal passage. All these signs constituted a language as rich and complex as any human tongue. And like a language, this tongue required years of study and practice to be mastered. The medieval treatises that recorded this wisdom, from Gaston Phoebus's Book of the Hunt to Edward of Norwich's Master of Game, from Frederick II's The Art of Hunting with Birds, to the countless smaller manuals that circulated through European courts, are testimonies to a tradition of ecological knowledge that modernity has almost completely erased. But it has not erased it entirely. The fundamental principles of medieval tracking survive in the practices of contemporary trackers who preserve this ancestral art. The ability to read footprints, interpret excrement, identify feeding and resting marks, and detect subtle disturbances in vegetation, all these skills that medieval hunters mastered continue to be taught and practiced by naturalists, conservationists, and wildlife enthusiasts around the world. The difference is that, while for medieval man these skills were a matter of survival, for the modern observer, they represent a bridge to a way of perceiving the world that technological civilization has made obsolete, but no less fascinating. And perhaps therein lies the deepest lesson that medieval tracking has to offer us. In an age where technology allows us to locate any point on the planet with precision to the centimeter, track animals with cameras and drones, and monitor wild populations by satellite, there is something simultaneously humble and grand in the image of that medieval tracker crouched on the forest floor, touching the earth with his fingertips, raising his eyes toward a distant bush, and knowing, with a certainty that no electronic device could match, that his prey was there just a few hours ago. This man did not need maps, compasses, or instruments. He had his senses, his knowledge, and the forest, and that was enough. The medieval forests no longer exist as they were. Many were cleared to make way for agriculture and cities. The great deer now live in protected reserves. The wolves that terrified medieval man were swept from vast portions of Europe before beginning to return slowly in recent decades. And the hunters who read the forest like an open book have been replaced by biologists armed with tracking collars and databases. But the forest still whispers to those willing to listen. There are still footprints in the mud. There are still branches broken by nocturnal passages. The silent language of nature has not changed. What has changed is us. When we look at an illuminated manuscript of the Book of the Hunt, with its miniatures showing hunters, dogs, and deer painted in vibrant colors on centuries-old parchment, we are looking at more than a work of art. We are looking at a survival manual, a scientific treatise, and a testimony of a relationship between human beings and nature that lasted for millennia. Each miniature freezes an instant of a practice that shaped landscapes, fed populations, trained warriors, and defined social hierarchies. The hunter who tracked his prey through the medieval forest was the heir to a tradition that dated back to the first human beings who learned to read the signs left by animals on the earth. This chain was broken, but not destroyed, and that is why it is worth remembering these forgotten methods, not as a historical curiosity, but as a testimony to the human capacity to observe, learn, and adapt to the natural world with a depth that modern technology, however powerful it may be, can never entirely replace. The next time you walk through a forest, pay attention to the ground beneath your feet. Observe the marks in the earth, the broken branches, the displaced leaves. Try to listen to what the forest is saying. Perhaps you will discover that the silent language of nature is still within reach of those willing to learn it. And if this narrative has awakened in you the curiosity to explore more stories like this, to dive into other forgotten chapters of human history and rediscover knowledge that time has almost erased, then consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription, every like, every comment you leave is like a footprint on the trail that guides us to produce more content like this. Just as medieval trackers followed the signs of the forest to find what they sought, we follow your signs to know we are on the right path. Leave your mark. Like, comment, share with those who appreciate a good story well told. And until the next journey through the forgotten trails of the past.